Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching us today. It's been 9 years since the Syrian regime committed the chemical massacre in Eastern Ghouta. It's been 9 years where thousands of Syrians woke up suffocating with the poisonous sarin gas. And it's been 9 years, and still there's no accountability in Syria. The perpetrators are not held accountable for what they committed, and there are no actual mechanisms that first persecute those perpetrators, and second, deny such attacks from happening again. And to discuss this further and to discuss what can actually be done, we have with us today Ibrahim Al-Olabi, who's a lawyer at Guernica 37 International Justice Chamber. So thank you very much, Ibrahim, for being with us today.
Okay.
I would like to start my first question with, what are the legal implications of a regime using lethal chemical weapons against civilian populations?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. So to start with, chemical weapons are banned against civilians and militants. It's one of these kind of weapons that are banned as a means of warfare, not the method, not against who would use them, which stresses how far the world has gone in kind of citing that it's an illegal weapon. It should never be used against civilians or combatants. The prohibition of chemical weapons started a long time ago. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, there are so many different treaties and protocols, starting in 1988 and moving on to 1925, and then the Geneva Conventions and protocols and so on. Now, the kind of the legal implications of any sort of use of chemical weapons, when we talk about a kind of accountability, should be seen a little bit in the wider sense of the word accountability, and we'll get to the courts issue in a moment. But usually in the past, treaties have been used to kind of get a commitment, and when a state breaches those commitments, it results, at least first of all, in losing its place in international relations, not seen as a credible partner, attracting condemnation by other actors if it breaches the treaty. The concept of courts did not exist back then as it did right now. So there's definitely a breach of several treaties. People say Syria wasn't part of the Organizational Prohibition of Chemical Weapons until 2013. That is correct, but the prohibition for chemical weapons goes back a long time ago. So, and it's customary in nature. So even if Syria ratified or didn't ratify a certain treaty, the ban of chemical weapons exists. So the legal implications, as I said, it can trigger reactions from other state parties to those treaties at a state level, right? I mean, at individual level, it can also create individual criminal responsibility if an avenue exists to prosecute these people, because we need to differentiate between two things. One, is there a breach of law? And two, if there is, what avenue do I have to prosecute or to use to hold that breach to account? And thirdly, even if I do have the avenue, is there a political will to use that avenue, right? So definitely on the breach, it exists. In terms of the avenue, it gets more complicated. And in terms of political will, it also gets a bit more complicated.
Exactly. So the issue of the political will bring me to my second question. How is it possible that amid all these treaties, international treaties that ban the use of chemical weapons, that the international community remains silent after such attack by the regime?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say. I mean, as people who kind of lived through the trauma and as friends and family members of victims and survivors, obviously nothing for us would be, everything that the world has done would be seen as silent. But if you remember in 2013, the American kind of warships moved. In 2017, the US bombed. In 2018, US and France and UK bombed. So they've even resulted to military action, right? So I wouldn't say necessarily it remained, the world has remained silent. We've had the French initiative against impunity for use of chemical weapons, which has more than 40 states plus the EU. We had the OPCW resolution against the Syrian regime, which was co-sponsored by 46 states and voted in favor by 87. And I'm using these numbers just to show you that this is not about the West versus East. 46 and 87 are much bigger numbers than that. And if you look at the Security Council resolutions and the General Assembly resolutions and the Human Rights Council resolutions, you would see a constant condemnation, right? So there isn't necessarily, I would say, silence against it. Is it what we want? No. Is it enough? Absolutely not. But it has been one of the files that the world has given attention to, perhaps unfairly compared to other kind of crimes that were committed. So it's definitely on the international world's radar, because there hasn't been any sort of mass use since Iraq times or so on. Yes, you had some of the odd North Korean example here and there, the Salisbury attack in the UK, but these kind of were individual attacks against people, nothing mass. So it did attract attention, but not to the extent and not to the kind of purpose that a lot of Syrian victims would have wanted.
And if we focus on the context of Syria, what are the possibilities of holding the officials of the Syrian regime accountable, including those who are responsible for ordering these attacks? What evidence is necessary to persecute these at the top of the regime hierarchy who had to give the green light for such use of chemical weapons?
Sure. So we need to differentiate between two things. We need to differentiate between state responsibility and and the responsibility of individuals. So in kind of individual criminal liability, right, for the use of chemical weapons. So in terms of state responsibility, which holds a state to account, not criminally, but that it kind of condemns the state and even takes legal action against it. That already has been to a very high level in the Syrian case, right? So the suspension from the OPCW can be seen as a way of invoking state responsibility. So 87 states agree with the findings of the OPCW that the regime has used chemical weapons. Now, when it comes to individual criminal liability, the use of chemical weapons actually is one of the easier crimes to prove the kind of chain of command, because it's not the kind of weapon that any kind of low-ranking soldier can mount on an airplane or on a helicopter. It's not the crime that you have to even if you didn't know, you should have taken steps that ought to have prevented such an attack, or you ought to have known. And let's assume, for argument's sake, the leadership in Syria did not know in 2013. The repeated use in 2017, 2018, 2019, and so on shows that they didn't take steps to prevent that from happening again. So chemical weapons is actually one of the easier crime on the spectrum of crimes, compared to, for example, a low-ranking soldier committing torture somewhere in a prison cell, for you to be able to kind of move up the ranks and attribute it to higher responsibility. Now, and then it's also been very widely criminalized. So it is a kind of a crime or an action that attracts criminal liability. Now, the question is, what avenues exist in order to hold those perpetrators to account? We've seen some complaints happening in some European jurisdictions, in France and Germany and Sweden and Switzerland and so on. These are kind of limited efforts, but they're very important efforts, because it keeps the file on the table, it adds more pressure, it uses a crime that is widely recognized. We haven't seen any sort of international avenue. There are talks now about creating something for chemical weapons specifically that would be able to hold the more senior to account, but these are very kind of early stages talks. So in terms of the evidence, and in terms of the chain of command, and in terms of the legal framework, it all exists. The question is, what sort of avenue do we have? Now, what states have done absent such a legal avenue, they've used sanctions, right? And sanctions are not a criminal tool, they're a kind of foreign policy tool, but you'll see a lot of the sanctions regime, European, the US and other Western countries, have sanctioned individuals, high-ranking individuals, for their complicity in the use of chemical weapons, right? So, but that's something available to a state on its own, or a group of state. It's not a court. And so even the kind of legal implication of it is lower, but it's a tool that has already been used. So the problem is more of the avenue rather than the evidence or the chain of command or the legality of it.
Exactly. And so, speaking of avenues, are there any avenues for the ICC to persecute? So what's the role of the III? Can this mechanism help persecute regime figures in countries where they have jurisdiction?
So starting with the ICC, as you know, the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over Syria. The referral that was attempted some years ago now was vetoed by the Russians and the Chinese. So the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction to look into this. It has jurisdiction to look into poisonous gas as a thematic issue, but not within the Syrian context. If the political will changes and there might be a referral that even kind of is backdated, that might be something that the ICC can definitely look into and prepare cases against. Absent that, in the current time, what we have is, yes, you had the So you had the Commission of Inquiry at the beginning, then you had the Joint Investigative Mechanism, then you had the OPCW fact-finding mission, and then you had the investigation and identification team, or identification investigation team, something along these lines, of the OPCW, that all kind of built the evidence. And my understanding is that there is an agreement between them and the IIIM to kind of hand over the data and share it, and then be able to build cases. So the kind of building of cases is kind of, as I understand it, ongoing. There's a lot of evidence in place. So in some areas, it's more missing than others, but there is a lot of evidence out there. The question again is a matter of avenue. Where will you present that evidence? But at least it's a good step, right? It's not something that's been left for a long time. It's not something that we don't have access to. It's something that's been very well documented, which can be used in other accountability avenues, right? So now the regime, for example, is seeking this normalization, and there's normalization efforts. So using chemical weapons and the evidence collected as a deterrent for that might be useful. Using it for sanctions purposes and so on. So while the kind of international and collective effort to prosecute individuals for a kind of individual criminal liability is still missing, and we don't have the political will to get there, that doesn't mean that we won't, and that doesn't mean that we cannot use the evidence that's been so far collected in the time being for other kind of non-judicial accountability mechanisms that exist to hold the regime to account.
And are there any relevant examples from history where such attacks happened and the perpetrators were actually held accountable?
So as I said, the criminal liability or criminal courts really started existing after after World War II, right? It was the Nuremberg trials, and if you look into those, I was actually doing some kind of research recently on this issue, and there hasn't been any sort of major case for people prosecuted and charged for the use of poisonous gas specifically, right? It's more murder and so on that not the use of the weapon, but the use of the weapon to kill that individual. There has been one case in Germany where a company, the Farben case, which was a case against a company that supplied the gas for the Holocaust and so on, and these people were kind of prosecuted, and it's a company that is linked directly to poisonous gas, but it's not been prosecuted for that use, right? It involved war crimes and genocide and so on, but not necessarily for that use.
Are there any relevant examples from history where such attacks happened and perpetrators were actually held accountable?
So again, it comes to the definition of what we mean by accountable. So by kind of condemnation, sanctions, military use, that obviously happened in Iraq and so on. But there are a few things that we need to remember. That the chemical weapon, the countries that have chemical weapons or have used chemical weapons in recent history are very few, right? It was more World War I, World War II behavior in that kind of sense. And so if we look at the Nuremberg trials, even the Nuremberg trials, the people who kind of were linked to murdering people using gases and other kind of weapons were prosecuted for murder and war crimes, not necessarily linked to the chemical weapons matter. There was one case where a company, the Farben company, was that kind of produced the gas used in the kind of Holocaust chambers. They were prosecuted, but and the board of directors and so on and senior staff. But although there is a chemical weapons link, the indictment did not include matters of chemical weapons. So there's actually very limited kind of case law for prosecution specifically on chemical weapons, which in a way shows two things. One, that the use is so prohibited that it hasn't happened so often, but two, shows that there is a chance for states that want to set a legacy to be able to make an example out of the use of chemical weapons in Syria by prosecuting such individuals.
And my last question is, given that accountability is one of the prerequisites of any safe return to Syria to be possible, what reforms will be needed for Syria to be a country that's safe for displaced Syrians to return to?
I mean, you can just look at the facts on the ground and see, people, even those who returned to Syria, a lot of them got detained, tortured. It's very clear that the regime doesn't want people to return. That those are kind of a huge risk. So it's more really systematic reforms that have to be taken into place. I don't think that the word reforms might be even possible, because it's more this kind of security apparatus that existed, that is ingrained in the DNA of the regime. So I do not see any kind of chance of, unless there's a proper political solution that is accompanied by, trials and justice mechanism and truth mechanisms and security sector reform and removing of immunities of such people and so on and so forth, that any sort of return might be possible.
That's it from my side. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. This was actually very insightful, and hope to speak to you again. Thank you.